Okay, so welcome once again to this study on the Book of Proverbs. And as I mentioned, we're going to be taking it a step at a time. And these first two lessons are introductory in that we're going to talk about the composition of the book. We're going to talk about the structure of the Book of Proverbs. We'll talk about the authorship today a little bit, a lot actually. And we'll go for about 2 hours. And if you have to step away and take a break, I'm not going to do a formal break, but if you need to walk away at any point and just get a breather, by all means do that. And I'll just continue and just keep moving at a steady pace. We're going to be looking at some of the text today, but as I mentioned in the opening session last week, I'm going to try to limit the text for the moment as we go through the introductory material, because it's important for us to understand the background. Because if you really want to comprehend the various elements of the book, it's always important to look at authorship. It's always important to look at the date. It's always important to look at the setting and the environment so that you can really understand the context in which the book was written. And we started some of that last week, as you recall, and we're going to do more of that today. And a little bit later, I'll be sharing my screens with you, and we'll look at those charts again, and we'll take a closer look and see what we can do to understand those a bit better. And just by the time we're done, we'll have, I believe, a nice framework for delving into the text itself. And then once we go into the text, then we can really go into the meat of the word. And we're going to go literally, so don't worry, because we're going to go literally verse by verse, right? There are over 900 verses in the Book of Proverbs. We're going to take our time with it. If it takes us 4 months, if it takes us 6 months, that's what we're going to do. I don't anticipate it'll take us more than 6 months, but with interruptions in between for the holy days, etc., we may wind up having a few sessions that we miss. But other than holy days or anything major that comes up, we're going to take it at a steady clip week by week. Okay. So for those of you who are joining for the first time, last week we talked about the overall structure of the book in terms of some of the words that are identified within the first chapter of the Book of Proverbs, and we're going to go into that more deeply in terms of the nuances, what it means about what is wisdom, what is discernment, what is prudence, all those things we're going to talk about in the course of our study. Because by the time it's all over, Yahweh willing, you're going to have a very, very thorough understanding of the Book of Proverbs. I decided to do it really intensively, and not just to give you an overview, but I really want you to understand this, because in my opinion, the Book of Proverbs is the heart of wisdom in the sacred scriptures. Because it is portable wisdom, it's something that if you grasp it and you have a really good understanding of each one of those verses and the different themes that are covered throughout the Book of Proverbs, when it's all said and done, you're going to be set for life in terms of understanding the various aspects of wisdom that Yahweh wants for us to learn. And of course, when you compare that with other scriptures throughout the Bible, it's going to give you a nice, well-rounded picture of the kind of wisdom that Yahweh wants us to have to be able to live in the day-to-day. Okay? So let's begin today by talking about just a couple of aspects of the Book of Proverbs. As a reminder, the title of the book, Mishlei, it comes from a Hebrew word, mashal. And that Hebrew word, mashal, means a comparison or a likeness. Because what you're doing is you are taking verses where you are comparing words, the one to another, in order to come up with a concept that's going to give you an understanding of a principle, right? The Book of Proverbs is loaded with principles, and these principles are going to help you understand various aspects of life. So the Proverbs that you see within the book are short, incisive statements to communicate behavioral, moral, and spiritual truths. I'm going to repeat that. The Book of Proverbs contains short, incisive statements to communicate behavioral, moral, and spiritual truths. Okay? So they're statements that are meant to convey action, right? They're meant to move you to action. It's not just, as I explained very deeply last week, they're not just words to give you intellectual stimulation, right? There's a lot of wisdom out there from different sources, Greek, Babylonian, Egyptian, that were in a major way designed to give you an intellectual understanding of a principle. But it's not so much the intellectual in which we're interested when we're looking at the Book of Proverbs. we're really interested in the practical, in the day-to-day. How can we use this to better our lives? How can we use this to make behavioral decisions in the moment? How can we use the statement to make a moral decision when we need it most? How can we glean a spiritual truth from this so that we can have hearts that are intimate with Almighty Yahweh, right? That's what we're looking for in the book of Proverbs. There are 31 chapters, about 915 verses or so, depending on who you ask. There are no secular proverbs, right? They're all intended to gear you towards the worship of Almighty Yahweh. They show us what is normal and right in terms of religious righteousness and social justice. In other words, they're showing you Yahweh's will in his commandments. Okay? We want to become like our Creator. We want to know his mind. And if we want to know his mind, we're going to understand the wisdom that these verses contain. Okay? So the chief author of the book of Proverbs was, of course, Solomon. And so if we go to Proverbs 1, verse 1, it tells you distinctly, and we're going to go through the various verses throughout, so just stay with me, okay? Proverbs 1:1 introduces you to the primary author of the book of Proverbs. And I say primary because he's not the only author, okay? So Proverbs 1:1 says, the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. Then if you go from Proverbs 1:1 over to Proverbs 10:1, just follow along with me here as we go to different sections. Proverbs 10:1 says, the Proverbs of Solomon, right? So we're told very explicitly that these are Proverbs of Solomon. Then you go to Proverbs 22, verse 1. Excuse me, not verse 1, verse 17. Proverbs 22:17. And then you're introduced to another group of sayings. So Proverbs 22:17 says, pay attention and turn your ear to the sayings of the wise. Apply your heart to what I teach. So in Proverbs 22:17, you see a distinct change, right? So 10 verse 1 actually begins specific proverbs. So what's happening is you have from Proverbs 1:1 to the end of chapter 9, you have an overall introduction to the book. And depending on the particular scholar who's reviewing it, this is broken down in different ways, right? So some people see the first few verses of Proverbs as a prologue, and then there's an introduction, and then they break it up into another type of section. But however they break that up, and that's all good and well, everyone does it a little bit differently. They have their take on it, and that's not important. What is important to understand is that chapters 1 through 9, most reviewers and commentators and scholars are agreed that chapters 1 through 9 serve as sort of an overall introduction to the book of Proverbs and set the tone for the rest of the book, which are the actual specific proverbs, the actual principles that we're going to review during the course of our study over these next several months. So the first several chapters, Proverbs 10:1 through 22:16, are specifically identified as Proverbs of Solomon, as you saw in Proverbs 10 verse 1, okay? But when you get to 22:17, you're talking about the wise. We'll talk about the wise a little bit later, who those might be, right? And remember, some of this is a bit of speculation, right? Because, again, if you ask 10 different scholars, they're going to give you 11 different opinions, right? It's like economists, right? That's the old joke about economists. If you ask 10 economists about what the economy is like, they're going to give you 11 different opinions. And it's really like that when you're studying religion, too. Scholars are out in many, they're out for knowledge, but they're also out to make a name for themselves. Let's be frank about it. And the way that you do that is by coming up with your own theory or your own take on something. So you always have to take scholarship with a grain of salt, right? You got to always respect scholarship because these folks take the time and in many cases, they devoted their lives and resources to really going in depth into these books and these texts, etc. So you really have to respect that. But you also have to take it with a grain of salt in that a lot of it is opinion, a lot of it's conjecture, and you're always going to have controversies that arise, and you can't let that throw your faith or disorient you because it's going to happen. You just have to expect that, and you have to try to make sense as best you can, and then just try to find the interpretations that are as closely aligned with Scripture as possible, but also always remaining intellectually honest about that. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're going to look at these sections in turn, and we're going to go in depth, beginning probably with next week's session. So 22:17, the words of the wise, we'll talk more about that a little bit later. And then when you get to chapter 25, actually, let's go back just a little bit. In chapter 24, there's even a little bit more of a distinction. So 24, 23, these also are sayings of the wise. So there's the sayings of the wise that are described at the beginning of middle of chapter 22, 22:17 forward, and then 24, 23 also are sayings of the wise. What's that all about? Well, we'll talk about that later. When you get to chapter 25, you go back to Proverbs of Solomon. So chapter 25, verse 1. These are more Proverbs of Solomon, but interestingly enough, compiled by the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah. Okay? So we're talking about 200 years later, after Solomon's reign, the men of Hezekiah, which is probably talking about court scribes of Hezekiah, and possibly some of the wise men of Hezekiah's time, that might have included prophets like Isaiah and Micah. Okay? They compiled sayings of Solomon, and they put them in the following chapters from 25 to 29. And then when you get to 30, you have the sayings of Agur, son of Jakeh, an inspired utterance. We don't really know who Agur was. And then in chapter 31, you have the sayings of King Lemuel, an inspired utterance his mother taught him. So you have Agur in chapter 30, Lemuel in chapter 31, and some people want to lump all these together and say, well, Agur and Lemuel were just other names for Solomon. I don't necessarily believe that. I think that's the easy answer. But I think any way you slice it, it doesn't matter, right? So sometimes people, they get nervous if it's not all Solomon, right? It doesn't have to be all Solomon. Yahweh has these sayings in the book for a reason, and he has them in the configuration in which they appear for a reason. So whether it was Solomon or not Solomon, doesn't matter. They're in the book, and they're in the book because ultimately Yahweh wanted them in the book because they were wise sayings and they're there for a particular reason, okay? So just understand that those distinctions exist. And a little bit later, when we start talking more about some of the structure, I'll show you the charts and we'll get into it. But I want to talk about the historical background in terms of the authorship, because again, you can really only understand context when you understand authorship. So let's talk a little bit about authorship. Let's talk about Solomon in particular. I have a lot to say about Solomon. So as I said last week, one of the things I'm using is I've looked at some of the things I've written in the past about the Proverbs, and I'm borrowing some of that because it's I put a lot of research into it. So I'm going to read some of that. I've made some changes and some modifications along the way, and I hope that this will give you some insight and understanding. And as I said last week, you know, if my first couple of lessons, 2 or 3 lessons, sound a little bit more professorial, I'm going to ask you to just bear with me, okay? Because I know that we really want to get into all the Proverbs themselves, in which case, by the time we do that, I'll be going through them in a more informal way. But just kind of bear with me with the professorial aspects right in the beginning, because this is important background information that you really need to know. So let's talk about the authorship. So the sacred scriptures, of course, are filled with illustrations of great men and women of faith whose example of wisdom and dedication are ideal for the person seeking to follow Yahweh. King Solomon of ancient Israel was one such example, right? Although he faltered in his dedication toward the end of his life, at least according to the biblical record, that's what we're told, no one can deny the importance of his legacy. Yahshua the Messiah made several references to Solomon and his greatness on a number of occasions in the New Testament writing. So we're going to turn to different scriptures as I go through this material. So let's turn over to Matthew 6, verse 29. Matthew 6, 29. And of course, this is Yahshua's discourse. It's part of the Sermon on the Mount. And in this particular section, he's talking about worry, right? And anxiety and how you should deal with that. So Matthew 6, verse 29, he refers to Solomon by name, and he says, "Yet I tell you that not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these." So he recognizes Solomon as being a person with great splendor in his time. Or just a few chapters later, Matthew 12, verse 42. Matthew 12, 42. "The queen of the south will rise at the judgment with this generation and condemn it. For she came from the ends of the earth to listen to Solomon's wisdom, and now something greater than Solomon is here." So, you know, he identifies Solomon as a man of great wisdom, and it's interesting to note that he refers to himself as something even greater than Solomon. So it's something just to keep in the back of your head. What about Luke 12, 27? Luke 12, 27. Yahshua says, oh, okay, this is just a restating of Matthew 12. No, he talks about Solomon and all his splendor was not even he was dressed like one of these. Speaking of the lilies of the field. Okay, so Yahshua refers to Solomon, and we all know that Solomon, we know from history that King Solomon was a spiritual and administrative giant of his time. I'm not even going to read you everything that I wrote about him, because in addition to, I'm just going to focus on the wisdom aspects, the aspects of Solomon as a writer and a conveyor of wisdom. But Solomon was also in his time a major arms dealer. And he was of course king, and he was very widely known throughout his reign as a master builder and as an administrator and as an arms dealer. We won't talk about those aspects, but there was a lot more than meets the eye to King Solomon because he had such great wisdom. One thing that's clear when you harmonize the scriptures that speak of Solomon along with the writings ascribed to him in the New Testament and elsewhere is that there was a lot of influence from the people that came before him, right, from his forebears, his parents, his grandparents, and others that came before him. King Solomon's spiritual and temporal accomplishments were directly influenced by the worldview that he gained based on the lessons that he learned from those people that came before him. So it's important to understand that wisdom was passed along from grandparent to parent, etc. Okay? And you see that influence reading specific proverbs when you talk about him referring to father, to mother, and to other wise people, right? King Solomon reigned from approximately 971 to 931 BCE. Okay, just giving you context of history. Some say between 962 to 922. So again, scholars are going to differ by a few years on that. But generally speaking, we're talking about the first century BCE. Proverbs 1:1, we already saw, identify Solomon as the writer, and Ecclesiastes 1:1, by the way, as another part of wisdom literature in the scriptures, identifies Solomon as the son of King David. The accounts of the life of Solomon are detailed in 1 Kings 1 through 11 and 1 Chronicles 28 to 2 Chronicles 9. And obviously, we're not going to go read all that now. We learn by reading those accounts that his mother was Bathsheba. And remember, if you remember, Bathsheba was the woman that David took to be his wife. He committed adultery with her. She was the wife of Uriah. And then, of course, to cover that up, he arranged for the murder of Uriah the Hittite, which was a pretty bad situation. In 2 Samuel 12, 24 to 25, we're not going to turn there, but we learned that Bathsheba bore Solomon to David, and Yahweh loved him. She had a baby from that union, from that initial union, and of course, the baby died. And then when he took her to be his wife, then they had Solomon. So so Solomon's mother was Bathsheba. And by means of Nathan the prophet, Yahweh named him Jedediah. And if you're looking that up, remember that when I give you words, I'm often going to give you the word number, so that if you want to go look it up in either Strong's Concordance or Brown Driver Briggs or some other lexicon, it'll be helpful for you. And that number is 3041, the name Jedediah. And that word means beloved of Yah. It's interesting because Jedediah is actually a form, sort of a form in this kind of rearrange. It's a form of the word David, which also means loved of Yahweh, right? So his name, Solomon, is number 8010, the name Shlomo, the 8010, and it means peaceful. Peaceful. It's interesting to note that while David's reign was characterized by almost constant military action, if you go look at the life of David, at least as described for us in the scriptures, it was almost constant warfare, even before he became king, right? In fact, that's how he came to prominence. And during the time of Israel's wars against the Philistines, David came along, and of course we know the account of David and Goliath. And then after he came officially on board as king later, it was all about warfare. The entire time he was there, the Philistines dogged him, and he had all kinds of problems. And it wasn't until the time of Solomon where any kind of regular peace and stability came to Israel. In fact, just a quick aside, I won't go into this deeply because there's a lot that can be said about it, but one of the reasons why I believe the temple could not be built. If you ask people why could David not build a temple, and they'll say, well, because David was a man of blood. He had a lot of blood in his hands because of warfare. And ostensibly on the surface, yeah, that's a reason that's given, but I don't believe that was the primary reason. The scriptures actually shows you what the primary reason was. And the reason was that the temple was going to be a center, a representation to the world of the prominence and glory of Yahweh, because that's how, in the ancient world, that's how peoples would have known. If you have this center there of worship, it's the fame is going to go out and about throughout the entire world. And the conditions, and here's the heart of it, the conditions were not right in the time of David in order for that reputation to be established, because there was just too much instability in the kingdom of Israel. That stability did not come until the reign of Solomon. So although Yahweh was pleased, the scriptures actually tell us that Yahweh was pleased with David because he had it in his heart to build a temple for him, but he did not allow to do it, not so much because he was a man of war, although that was part of it, but more importantly because there was no stability in the kingdom yet, and therefore you could not have an issue of credibility with the nations around them. But that credibility certainly came in the time of Solomon. So therefore Solomon, David's son, was allowed to proceed and build a temple, and it was a glorious thing. And as you saw in just what we read, people came from all over the world, including the Queen of Sheba, right, because they learned about the greatness of Yahweh through Solomon. Okay, so Solomon's reign, in his reign, they enjoyed a time of peace and prosperity, hence his name, Shlomo. Remember, names were given that would be characteristic of the person's, that would be representative of the person's characteristics. So the fact that Solomon would be one who would reign in a time of peace was critical, was important. Okay. Now his father and mother, King David and Queen Bathsheba, influenced Solomon in a substantial way, right? It's crystal clear when you examine the Book of Proverbs. Solomon gives reference to the importance of the advice of father and mother. So, we'll just take a couple of verses. So if you look at Proverbs 1, verse 8, and there are many we could turn to, of course. Proverbs 1, verse 8, listen, my son, to your father's instruction. Do not forsake your mother's teaching, right? Proverbs 6, verses 20 and 21. Proverbs 6:20, my son, keep your father's command and do not forsake your mother's teaching. Bind them always on your heart. Fasten them around your neck. When you walk, they will guide you. When you sleep, they will watch over you. When you awake, they will speak to you. This is very poignant, right? I don't want to get too deeply in commentary, but think about what's being said here. Remember that the parents are a child's primary teachers. They're the first teachers. In the biblical construct, the child would be most often with the mother, right? Now, of course, in our day and age, social mores are changing a bit, where you have different types of, differences in gender and the way things are done. But the way that you see it in the scriptures, the mother would be typically home with the child, and the father would be working and doing his thing, and maybe in the army, etc. And the mother would be the primary teacher, the primary instructor of that child. And then, of course, the father would be more of the disciplinarian, more the voice of authority. And there's a lot more that I'll say about that as we get to those particular verses. But they both brought, mother and father, they both brought elements of instruction and discipline into the life of that child from very young. So in effect, those parents served as the voice and the presence of Elohim in that child's life, because to a child, the mother and father are Elohim, right? At that moment, that's all they know. So it's important that the mother and father be very well instructed in the ways of wisdom, so that they could properly teach their children and give them that strong foundation that's going to help them throughout the rest of their lives. And in fact, it's so interesting that nowadays, of course, sadly, there's a lot less respect that's accorded to mother and father, but in the biblical scheme of things, the importance of the mother and father are critical, right? That's why you have an entire commandment that's devoted towards respect towards mother and father. That's not by accident, right? Because the mother and father serve as that initial foundation to give that child the discipline and the knowledge and the love and everything that they're going to need in order to shape and mold their attitudes, their morality, their behavior that's going to carry them later into life. And interestingly, we talk about the wise men that we see in Proverbs 22:17 and 24. The whole concept of a wise man is related to the parents. You'll even see biblical figures speaking about their teachers as my father. If you remember Elisha speaking about Elijah, he referred to him as my father, right? Because it was as if it wasn't just a random title. It was meant to elicit the concept of a father who had been, this person was like a father to him, right? He was a mentor, just like a father had been a mentor to him, right? Or you see the prophet Deborah in the time of the judges, who's referred to as a mother in Israel. That's not coincidental that she's referred to as a mother in Israel, right? She's a mother of Israel because she's a nurturing type, tough lady too. She was, a very strong leader in her time. So mother and father, the influence of mother and father are just paramount in the sacred scriptures. And certainly that was true for Solomon. And you see also Proverbs 31:1, right? We're talking to Lemuel, about Lemuel. And again, whether Lemuel was Solomon or not, I don't think it was. But whether it was or not, it doesn't matter. It's still, the principle is still the same. The sayings of, this is Proverbs 31:1. The sayings of King Lemuel, an inspired utterance his mother taught him, right? Listen, my son. Listen, son of my womb. Listen, my son, the answer to my prayers. Then she goes on and she gives him the advice, right? Do not spend your strength on women, your vigor on those who ruin kings. It's not for kings, Lemuel. It's not for kings to drink wine, nor for rulers to crave beer, etc. So she's giving him very strong, sound advice for him to establish his kingdom. Yes. So the influence of the ultimate point here is the influence of mother, father. Very, very important scripture. One more thing, and then I'll move on from this topic. 1 Kings chapter 2. You go over to 1 Kings chapter 2. This is during the reign of Solomon. And we'll begin in chapter 9, in verse 19. 1 Kings 2:19. And the setting of this is that Solomon has just become ruler because David has died. And his brother Adoniah had been a pretender to the throne. And then we won't go through the whole story, but there's something underhanded going on with Adoniah. And Adoniah sends his mother, Bathsheba, not his mother, Solomon's mother. He talks to her, and who's his mother? Bathsheba, right? And he says, go and talk to Solomon and ask him for something for me. So she goes and she does that. And I just want you to note the attitude that Solomon had towards her. That's the rest of the story is not important at the moment, but in this context, I just want you to see the level of respect that's accorded to his mother. This is 1 Kings 2:19. When Bathsheba went to King Solomon to speak to him for Adoniah, the king stood up to meet her, bowed down to her, and sat down on his throne. He had a throne brought for the king's mother, and she sat down on his right hand. It's a lot of respect accorded to his mother. He's the king in Israel, right? But this is his mother. He stands up, bows down, then he sits on his throne. He has a throne brought for her, and then they can conduct their business. Okay, a lot of respect. Then, of course, the respect of a father is also unquestioned in the scriptures. David's influence is illustrated as well. If you look at 1 Kings, just a few verses before, chapter 2, but verse 1, Solomon is on his deathbed. And he wants to give Solomon some final word. David is on his deathbed. And he wants to give Solomon some words of wisdom. So it says in 1 Kings 2, verse 1, when the time drew near for David to die, he gave a charge to Solomon, his son. I'm about to go the way of all the earth, he said. So be strong, act like a man, and observe what Yahweh your Elohim requires. Walk in obedience to him, and keep his decrees and commands, his laws and regulations, as written in the law of Moses. Do this so that you may prosper in all you do, and wherever you go, and that Yahweh may keep his promise to me. If your descendants watch how they live, and if they walk faithfully before me with all their heart and soul, you will never fail to have a successor on the throne of Israel. So, and he goes through and he gives more advice. There were certain things that had happened during David's reign that he wanted taken care of, people who had done him wrong and situations that had to be straightened out. He goes on to give Solomon advice. Hey, please take care of all these things. And you know what? Solomon did every last one of them. Solomon followed David's advice perfectly as he consolidated his power. For some reason, my computer is on, it may not be plugged in, and I'm about to lose power.